The vault door swung open with a hydraulic hiss that echoed through the underground chamber. Ibrahim Traoré froze in the doorway, his hand still gripping the steel handle, his breath catching in his throat. Where $50 billion in gold should have been, neatly stacked bars gleaming under the fluorescent lights, each one stamped with the seal of Burkina Faso. There was nothing but empty shelves stretching into the shadows. The silence was absolute, deafening in its completeness. In that single moment, standing at the threshold of the most secure facility in the country, Ibrahim realized that someone had just stolen an entire nation's future. His footsteps echoed against the reinforced steel walls as he walked deeper into the vault, each step feeling heavier than the last. The underground facility of the Central Bank of Burkina Faso had been designed by French engineers, built by Chinese contractors, and secured by Israeli technology. It was supposed to be impenetrable. The vault itself sat 30 meters below ground level, protected by 4 separate security checkpoints, biometric scanners, and a door that weighed 7 tons. Behind him, Bank Governor Dr. Amina Sankara was breathing heavily, her normally composed face pale with shock. She had been governor for 5 years, overseeing every aspect of the nation's monetary policy with meticulous attention to detail. In all that time, she had never missed a single quarterly inspection. The gold had been there yesterday. She had counted it herself. "Sir," she whispered, her voice barely audible in the cavernous space, trembling with disbelief. "This is impossible. The gold was here yesterday. I personally supervised the quarterly inspection. Every single bar was accounted for. I signed the verification documents myself." She moved toward the empty shelves, her hands trembling as she touched the spots where gold bars worth more than the GDP of most African nations had been stored just 24 hours earlier. Her fingers traced the outlines where dust patterns showed the recent presence of the missing bars, evidence of a theft so recent that the environment itself hadn't yet adjusted to their absence. The security chief, Colonel Mamadou Zerbo, stood frozen in the doorway, his military bearing momentarily shattered by the impossibility of what he was witnessing. His hand moved instinctively toward the weapon at his hip, a reflexive gesture born of 30 years of military service, as if he could somehow shoot their way out of this nightmare. Zerbo had overseen security operations during 3 different presidencies. He had defended the country against attempted coups, prevented assassination attempts, and maintained order during civil unrest. But nothing in his extensive experience had prepared him for this. Ibrahim said nothing at first. His mind was racing through the implications of what he was seeing, calculating the cascading consequences of this theft with the strategic thinking that had made him one of Africa's youngest presidents. $50 billion in gold didn't just disappear like coins from a pocket. This wasn't a simple theft, wasn't the work of ordinary criminals looking for a quick profit. This was a precisely orchestrated operation, planned and executed with military precision. This was an act of war against Burkina Faso itself, an attack on the very foundation of the nation's sovereignty. The gold reserves represented everything his government had worked for over the past 3 years. Independence from foreign currencies, economic sovereignty free from the dictates of international financial institutions, the ability to build schools and hospitals without begging for international loans laden with impossible conditions. The reserves had been the cornerstone of his administration's ambitious development plans, the financial foundation that would allow Burkina Faso to chart its own course without bowing to foreign pressure. Now it was all gone. Ibrahim was 42 years old, younger than most world leaders, and his rise to power had been as unconventional as his policies. A former military officer with degrees in economics from universities in both Africa and Europe, he had come to power 3 years earlier, promising to break Burkina Faso free from the economic dependency that had characterized the post-colonial era. His speeches about African economic sovereignty had inspired young people across the continent while making him deeply unpopular with certain international interests who preferred the old arrangements. The gold reserves had been central to his vision. Over his 3 years in office, he had systematically accumulated the precious metal, converting foreign currency holdings and commodity revenues into physical gold stored in this very vault. Every bar represented a piece of Burkina Faso's independence, tangible proof that the country could stand on its own economic foundation. But what Ibrahim would discover in the security footage would make the missing gold seem like the least of his problems. Colonel Zerbo was already on his radio, his voice steady despite the shock evident in his eyes, calling for an immediate lockdown of all bank exits and the surrounding area. All units, this is Security Chief Zerbo. Code Black, I repeat, Code Black. Implement immediate perimeter seal. No one enters or exits the facility until further notice. No exceptions. He turned to Ibrahim, his professionalism reasserting itself even as his mind struggled to process what they had discovered. Sir, I've ordered a complete perimeter seal. No one gets in or out until we understand what happened here. I'm also calling in the Presidential Guard and activating emergency security protocols. His voice was professional, trained and disciplined, but Ibrahim could hear the underlying panic, the slight tremor that betrayed his shock. In his 20 years of security work, protecting 3 different presidents and overseeing countless high-security operations, Zerbo had never seen anything like this. He had dealt with armed insurgencies, terrorist threats, and assassination attempts, but someone stealing $50 billion in gold from a supposedly impenetrable vault without triggering a single alarm was beyond anything in his experience. Ibrahim walked slowly along the empty shelves, his military training kicking in as he began to analyze the scene like a crime investigator. He had spent 5 years in the military before pursuing his education, including 2 years with an elite reconnaissance unit. That training had taught him to see details that others missed, to read environments and understand the stories they told. The vault showed no signs of forced entry. The sophisticated lock system, installed just 18 months earlier at a cost of 3 million euros, appeared completely undamaged. There were no obvious tool marks, no scorch marks from cutting torches, no evidence of explosives or drilling. The reinforced concrete walls were intact, showing no signs of breaching. The floor was clean, with no debris or dropped tools that might indicate hasty work. Whoever had done this had either been incredibly sophisticated, using technology beyond what most people had access to, or they had help from inside, someone who knew the security protocols and could bypass them without leaving evidence. Dr. Sankara, Ibrahim said, his voice steady despite the chaos churning in his mind. I need you to pull all the security recordings from the past week. Everything. Every camera, every access log, every person who came within 100 meters of this vault. He paused, turning to look directly at the bank governor. And I need a complete list of everyone who has access to this facility. Everyone, regardless of their position or clearance level. Dr. Sankara nodded quickly, grateful to have something concrete to do, some action to take in the face of this incomprehensible disaster. Of course, Mr. President, I'll have my staff begin compiling the records immediately. But, sir, you should know that vault access is extremely limited. Only myself, the deputy governor, the chief security officer. She hesitated, her face showing the reluctance to voice what she was thinking. And Finance Minister Adro Dow have the authorization codes. Ibrahim's jaw tightened slightly, a subtle movement that those who knew him well would recognize as a sign of carefully controlled anger. In the 3 years since Ibrahim had taken power, since the election that had surprised international observers and domestic opponents alike, Adro Dow had been one of his most trusted advisors. The man had been with him since the beginning, helping to design the very economic policies that had defined his presidency. Dow had helped design the very security protocols that were supposed to protect this gold. If anyone knew how to circumvent the system, understood its vulnerabilities and weak points, it would be him. The thought was deeply disturbing, raising questions about trust and betrayal that Ibrahim didn't want to confront. Then Dr. Sankara said something that made Ibrahim's blood run cold, words that would transform this from a theft into something far more dangerous. Sir, according to our records, you authorized this transfer yourself. The words hung in the air like a physical presence, heavy with implications. Ibrahim turned slowly to face Dr. Sankara, his eyes narrowing, his body language shifting into something more dangerous. What did you just say? His voice was dangerously quiet, the tone that anyone who knew him recognized as a warning. The calm before the storm. The transfer authorization, sir, Dr. Sankara repeated, her voice shaking as she realized the magnitude of what she was revealing. It bears your digital signature and was processed through your official account. According to the computer system, according to all our records, you personally authorized the movement of the gold reserves at 11:47 p.m. last night. She pulled up the documents on her tablet with trembling hands, turning the screen to show Ibrahim. There it was, an official transfer authorization complete with his digital signature, his personal identification codes, and the presidential seal. The document ordered the immediate transfer of all gold reserves to a secure holding facility. Citing security concerns that required immediate action, Ibrahim felt the world shifting beneath his feet. A sensation of vertigo that had nothing to do with physical balance. Someone hadn't just stolen Burkina Faso's gold. They had framed him for authorizing its removal, created a paper trail that would make it appear as though he had personally ordered the theft of his own country's reserves. This wasn't just theft. It was a sophisticated setup designed to destroy him politically while enriching whoever was behind this conspiracy. The implications were staggering, spreading out in his mind like cracks in breaking ice. If word got out that the president himself had authorized the removal of the country's gold reserves, it would trigger a constitutional crisis that could bring down the government. His political opponents, who had been searching for any excuse to challenge his leadership, would have exactly the ammunition they needed. International observers would question his competence and judgment. The carefully constructed edifice of his presidency could collapse within days. Colonel Zerbo, Ibrahim said, his voice tight with controlled fury, I need to see those transfer documents immediately, every page, every detail, and I want a complete forensic analysis of the computer systems. I want to know who accessed these systems, when they accessed them, and what they did while they were in there. He paused, his mind working through the possibilities. Someone has either hacked our most secure networks, bypassed security systems that cost millions of dollars and were supposed to be state-of-the-art, or, he paused, the alternative too disturbing to voice immediately, or someone with the highest level access has betrayed this country. The security chief was already moving toward the bank's main computer terminal, his military training taking over as he began to coordinate the investigation. Sir, I should also mention that there was unusual activity in the building last night. Several anomalies that didn't trigger alerts at the time but are now looking highly suspicious. Ibrahim looked up sharply. What kind of activity? The night security supervisor, Mamadou Konko, called in sick at 6 p.m. yesterday, Zerbo explained, pulling up security logs on his phone. His replacement was someone I don't recognize from the regular staff. The man gave his name as Seydou Ouedraogo and provided apparently valid credentials. But I've checked our personnel database, and there's no record of anyone by that name being employed in bank security. This detail sent another chill through Ibrahim's mind. Another piece of evidence suggesting careful planning and inside knowledge. The night shift supervisor, Mamadou Konko, had been working bank security for 15 years. He was known for his reliability, his dedication, his almost obsessive attention to duty. The man had worked through his daughter's wedding, through his mother's funeral, through a bout of malaria that had left him bedridden for a week. He had never called in sick during a major security operation, never missed a shift without weeks of advance notice. The timing was too convenient to be coincidental. Whoever planned this operation had known that Konko's absence would create an opportunity, had either coerced him into calling in sick or had done something to ensure he couldn't report for duty. I want Konko found immediately, Ibrahim ordered, and I want to know everything about this Seydou Ouedraogo, where he came from, who verified his credentials, how he got past our background checks. As they walked back toward the main banking floor, their footsteps echoing in the corridors that now felt more like a crime scene than a secure facility, Ibrahim's phone rang. The caller ID showed it was his chief of staff, Marcus Ouedraogo, probably calling with the morning schedule and completely unaware of the catastrophe that had just unfolded. But when Ibrahim answered, the voice on the other end was not who he expected. Instead of Marcus's familiar tones, he heard a voice he didn't recognize. Speaking in accented English with the confident tones of someone used to being obeyed, "Mr. President," said the voice, I believe you've discovered our little withdrawal by now. Ibrahim stopped walking, his hand tightening on the phone, every muscle in his body tensing. Behind him, Dr. Sankara and Colonel Zerbo also froze, sensing from his body language that something was wrong, that this crisis was about to expand in ways they hadn't anticipated. "Who is this?" Ibrahim demanded, his voice hard. "Someone who has been watching your financial management with great interest," the voice continued, unhurried and confident. "Your country's gold is safe for now, Mr. President, quite safe. But whether it stays safe, whether you ever see it again, depends entirely on your cooperation with certain international requirements." The voice paused, letting the implications sink in. "We'll be in touch soon with specific instructions. I suggest you don't do anything rash in the meantime. And, Mr. President, don't bother trying to trace this call. We're far more sophisticated than your local telecommunications infrastructure can track." The line went dead before Ibrahim could respond, leaving him staring at the phone, his mind processing what he had just heard. This wasn't just theft, wasn't just a criminal operation aimed at enriching the perpetrators. This was extortion, a calculated move designed to force his government into compliance with unnamed international requirements. But the most chilling part was the implication behind the call, the demonstration of how thoroughly his movements and activities were being monitored. Someone had been watching the situation closely enough to know exactly when Ibrahim would discover the theft, suggesting a level of surveillance and coordination that went far beyond a simple criminal operation. They had probably been watching him for months, maybe years, building a comprehensive picture of his routines, his responses, his vulnerabilities. "Sir," Colonel Zerbo was looking at him with concern, reading the tension in Ibrahim's posture. "What is it?" "What did they say?" Ibrahim looked at his security chief, at Dr. Sankara, at the bank employees who were beginning to gather, drawn by the unusual activity and the obvious tension. He made a decision. "We're not dealing with ordinary thieves," Ibrahim replied grimly, his voice carrying to everyone present. "This is something much bigger and much more dangerous than a simple robbery. This is an attack on our sovereignty, on our independence, and we're going to fight it with everything we have." The revelation came from the forensics team that Colonel Zerbo had called in from the National Police, a specialized unit trained in handling high-level crimes and security breaches. Ibrahim was in the bank's conference room, a windowless space dominated by a large table now covered with printouts, photographs, and computer displays, reviewing security footage with Dr. Sankara when the chief forensic investigator burst in with a report that changed everything they thought they knew about the case. "Mr. President," the investigator said, his face pale with confusion, his professional composure cracking under the weight of what he had discovered. "We've identified the fingerprints found on the inner vault door. But there's a problem, a serious problem that I can barely believe myself." Ibrahim looked up from the security footage he had been studying. "What kind of problem?" "The prints belong to Marcel Dialama, the former finance minister," the investigator said, and then added the detail that made his statement impossible, "who died in a helicopter crash in 2014, 10 years ago." Ibrahim felt his blood freeze, a cold sensation spreading through his chest. Marcel Dialama had been his predecessor's most trusted economic advisor until his death, in what had appeared to be an unfortunate accident. The helicopter carrying Dialama and 3 other government officials had crashed during a routine flight to inspect mining operations in the north. The crash had been devastating. The helicopter had gone down in a remote area during a storm, and by the time rescue teams reached the site, there had been no survivors and no question about the cause: catastrophic mechanical failure during severe weather. "That's impossible," Dr. Sankara said, voicing what everyone in the room was thinking. "Marcel Dialama is buried in the National Cemetery. I attended his funeral myself. There were thousands of mourners. The president at the time gave the eulogy. We watched them lower the casket into the ground. But the forensic investigator was adamant, his scientific training making him certain despite the impossibility of his conclusion. Sir, we've run the prints through multiple systems. Our national database, Interpol, the African Union Security Network, even the FBI database that they allow us limited access to. We've compared them against archived records from Dialama's time in government. There's no doubt, no possibility of error. These are Marcel de Alama's fingerprints, and based on the skin oil residue and cellular degradation patterns, they were left on that vault door within the last 48 hours. The room fell silent as everyone processed what this meant. Ibrahim's mind was racing through the possibilities, analyzing each one with the systematic approach he had learned in military intelligence training. Either someone had somehow faked fingerprints, which seemed technically possible but extraordinarily difficult. It would require access to archived fingerprint records, sophisticated equipment, and expertise in biometric deception that few people possessed. Or Marcel de Alama had not actually died in that helicopter crash 10 years ago. He had faked his death, remained hidden for a decade, and had now emerged to steal Burkina Faso's gold reserves. The implications of the second possibility were staggering, opening up questions that reached deep into the past and spread wide into the present. "I want everything we have on the de Alama helicopter crash," Ibrahim ordered, his voice sharp with urgency. "Flight records, weather reports, crash investigation findings, autopsy reports, witness statements, everything. Every document, every photograph, every piece of evidence. And I want it within the hour." Colonel Zerbo was already on his phone, coordinating with the National Archives and the Civil Aviation Authority, pulling rank and citing presidential authority to overcome any bureaucratic resistance. But Ibrahim could see from his expression that the security chief was also thinking through the disturbing implications of what they had discovered, running through the same calculations and reaching the same troubling conclusions. If Marcel de Alama was alive, it meant that his death had been faked 10 years ago, that an elaborate deception had been staged and maintained for a decade. But why? And by whom? What purpose could possibly justify such an elaborate long-term operation? De Alama had been the architect of several major economic reforms during the previous government, a brilliant economist with advanced degrees from French universities. He had also been the person responsible for establishing the very security protocols that protected the gold reserves, the systems that had just been so thoroughly compromised. If anyone would know how to steal the gold without triggering alarms, it would be him. He had designed those alarms, knew every weakness, every vulnerability, but that raised an even more disturbing question that made Ibrahim's skin crawl. If de Alama had faked his death and remained hidden for 10 years, what had he been doing during that time? Where had he been? What had he been planning? And why surface now, after a decade of silence, to steal Burkina Faso's gold reserves? The answer came faster than Ibrahim expected, delivered by Colonel Zerbo in a worn manila folder that looked like it had been stored in a basement for years. Within 30 minutes of Ibrahim's order, Zerbo returned with a file that contained information that would reshape everything they understood about the case. "Sir, you need to see this," Zerbo said, spreading documents across the conference table with hands that weren't quite steady. I pulled the complete file on the helicopter crash investigation. There were several irregularities that were never properly explained, questions that were never adequately answered. The documents painted a picture of an investigation that had been rushed to conclusion, pushed toward a predetermined outcome rather than following evidence wherever it led. The crash site had been cleaned up unusually quickly, within 48 hours, far faster than standard protocol for a high-level government incident. The bodies had been cremated before complete autopsies could be performed, supposedly at the request of grieving families who wanted traditional funeral rites. But the documentation of these requests was surprisingly sparse. Most significantly, the helicopter's flight data recorder, the so-called black box that should have contained crucial information about the cause of the crash, had mysteriously malfunctioned and provided no usable data. This alone should have triggered a more extensive investigation, but instead, the incident had been quickly classified as an unfortunate accident and the file closed. But the most revealing document was a witness statement that had been buried deep in the file, marked as unverified and apparently never properly followed up. A farmer named Boubacar Sanogo, who lived near the crash site, had reported seeing people moving around the wreckage before the official rescue teams arrived. According to his statement given to local police within hours of the crash, he had seen what looked like a well-organized team extracting something from the helicopter while it was still smoking. When investigators had tried to follow up on this report 2 days later, they were told that Sanogo had suddenly left the area, gone to visit relatives in another region, and could not be located. There was no record of any further attempts to find him or verify his statement. "This wasn't an accident," Ibrahim said quietly, studying the documents with growing certainty. "This was an extraction. Someone arranged for Marcel de Alama to disappear, staged a helicopter crash complete with other victims to make it look real, and he's been working in the shadows ever since." Dr. Sankara was looking at the papers with growing horror, her hands shaking slightly as she picked up the witness statement. But why? Marcel was a respected economist. He had a good position, a comfortable life, the respect of his peers. He had no reason to fake his death. What could possibly motivate someone to give up everything like that? "Unless he was working for someone else," Ibrahim replied, his voice hard. "Someone who needed him to disappear, to operate without scrutiny. Someone who could provide him with resources and protection in exchange for his expertise and inside knowledge." The implications were spreading like ripples in water, touching more and more aspects of recent Burkina Faso history. If de Alama had been working for foreign interests for 10 years, what else had he been involved in? What other operations had he planned or participated in? How much damage had he done to his country's interests while pretending to be dead? "I want a complete review of every major economic decision made in the 5 years before de Alama's supposed death," Ibrahim ordered. Every policy recommendation he made, every reform he advocated for, every international agreement he helped negotiate. If he was planning to betray the country, there might be evidence in his earlier work, patterns we missed at the time. When Ibrahim called the number buried in the transfer documents, hidden among routing, codes and reference numbers that most people would never examine closely, the voice that answered spoke with a French accent so precise and cultivated that it immediately suggested elite education and privileged. "Background. We've been expecting your call. Mr. President." The number had taken Dr. Sankara's staff 3 hours to find, buried in the fine print of the authorization documents that supposedly bore Ibrahim's signature. When Ibrahim finally dialed the number, using a secure line with recording equipment hastily set up by Colonel Zerbo's team, he was prepared for almost anything. But what he got was a conversation that would expose the true scope of the conspiracy against his country, revealing connections that reached far beyond anything they had imagined. "Mr. President," the French-accented voice continued before Ibrahim could speak, "you've been remarkably quick in discovering our operation. We had expected it to take you at least another day to piece together the connection to Marcel de Alama. Your reputation for intelligence appears to be well-deserved." Ibrahim remained silent, letting the caller continue, gesturing to Colonel Zerbo to make sure every word was being recorded. His phone was connected to sophisticated recording equipment, and every word would be documented as evidence, preserved for whatever legal or political battles lay ahead. "I suppose you're wondering why we've taken your gold," the voice said, speaking with the casual confidence of someone who believed they held all the power in this situation. "The answer is quite simple, really. Your country has become an inconvenience to certain international arrangements that have been in place for decades. Your insistence on economic independence, your rejection of traditional aid packages, your refusal to grant mining concessions to established partners, all of this has created problems that need to be addressed." The caller's tone was matter-of-fact, as if he were discussing a minor business disagreement rather than the theft of an entire nation's reserves, rather than an attack on Burkina Faso's sovereignty. This casual attitude, this complete lack of moral concern, made his words even more chilling. "Marcel de Alama has been quite useful in this regard," the voice continued. "His presumed death allowed him to develop relationships and gather intelligence without the scrutiny that would have accompanied his official position. For 10 years, he has been preparing for this moment, building networks, gathering information, identifying vulnerabilities in African financial systems." Ibrahim finally spoke, his voice carefully controlled. "What do you want?" "Quite reasonable terms, actually," the caller replied, and Ibrahim could hear the smile in his voice. "A new mining agreement that provides reasonable access to your country's natural resources. A reconsideration of your currency policies to align more closely with regional standards, to abandon this foolish gold standard you've been developing. And perhaps most importantly, a more cooperative approach to international development partnerships, accepting the aid packages we've offered, working with our designated consultants and advisors. The euphemistic language couldn't disguise what was really being demanded. The caller was asking Ibrahim to reverse all of the economic independence policies that had defined his presidency, that had made him a hero to young Africans and a target for international financial interests. In exchange for the return of the gold, he was expected to surrender Burkina Faso's sovereignty and return to the old system of foreign economic control, to become another compliant African leader willing to sell his country's resources for personal benefit. And if I refuse? Ibrahim asked, though he already knew the answer. Then the gold remains in its new location? And your government faces the interesting challenge of explaining to your people why their national reserves have vanished under your leadership, the voice said smoothly. I'm sure the opposition parties would find that information quite useful. In fact, we've already made contact with certain opposition figures who would be very interested in evidence suggesting your personal involvement in the gold's disappearance. The threat was clear. If Ibrahim didn't comply, not only would the gold remain stolen, but evidence would be released showing that he had apparently authorized its removal. His political career would be destroyed, his reputation ruined, and whoever succeeded him would likely be much more amenable to foreign influence, much more willing to accept the old arrangements. But the caller made one crucial mistake in his confidence, one slip that would provide Ibrahim with his first real advantage in this fight. He provided too much information about Marcel Dialama's role in the operation, mentioned specific locations where Dialama had operated, referenced particular economic negotiations where the dead man had been secretly present. That information gave Ibrahim the first real lead he'd had in tracking down the stolen gold and understanding the full scope of the conspiracy. After ending the call, Ibrahim sat in silence for a long moment, his mind processing everything he had heard. Then he looked up at Colonel Zerbo and Dr. Sankara, who had listened to the conversation in growing alarm. We need to expand this investigation immediately, Ibrahim said. This isn't just about our gold anymore. This is about a systematic campaign to control African economic policy, and we need to understand how deep it goes. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. While Ibrahim was coordinating the investigation into Marcel Dialama's background, pulling files and tracking movements over the past decade, his youngest advisor, Fatima Makonko, had been analyzing the transfer documents from a different angle. As a recent graduate of the London School of Economics, only 26 years old but brilliant in her field, she had been trained to follow financial trails that others might miss, to see patterns in data that looked like random noise to less sophisticated analysts. Mr. President, she said, bursting into the conference room where Ibrahim was reviewing intelligence reports with his senior team. Her excitement was obvious, despite her attempt at professional composure. I found something in the transfer routing codes. The gold wasn't just moved. It was shipped, and I think I know where it is right now. She spread out printouts of shipping manifests and satellite tracking data across the table, pushing aside other documents to make room. The transfer documents referenced a cargo container with a specific identification number, SACH 2847393. I cross-referenced that number with international shipping databases, and I found the container on a vessel called the Sahelian Hope. Ibrahim recognized the name immediately, felt his stomach drop. The Sahelian Hope was a humanitarian aid ship that regularly carried medical supplies and educational materials to children across West Africa. It was operated by an international charity with an excellent reputation, an organization that had worked closely with several African governments, including Burkina Faso. The ship's blue and white paint scheme was famous across the region, a symbol of hope and international cooperation. According to the shipping manifest, Fatima continued, pulling up more data on her tablet, the Sahelian Hope left the port of Cotonou in Benin yesterday morning. It's listed as carrying educational supplies and medical equipment for children in conflict zones, textbooks, vaccines, water purification equipment, But when I checked the weight and cargo specifications, they don't match the declared contents. The ship is carrying far more weight than books and medicine would account for, and the cargo distribution suggests something much denser than normal humanitarian supplies. Colonel Zerbo was already pulling up satellite tracking data on his laptop, his fingers flying over the keyboard. If it left Cotonou yesterday morning, it should be somewhere off the coast of Nigeria by now. He typed rapidly, accessing real-time maritime tracking systems that his security clearance allowed him to use. There it is. The vessel is currently 80 nautical miles southwest of Lagos, moving northwest at 12 knots. Ibrahim stared at the satellite image that Zerbo pulled up on the conference room's main screen. The ship looked perfectly ordinary, a medium-sized cargo vessel with the distinctive blue and white paint scheme used by the humanitarian organization. There was nothing to suggest that it was carrying stolen gold worth $50 billion. Nothing to indicate it was anything other than what it claimed to be. But the more Ibrahim thought about it, the more brilliant the cover became, the more perfectly designed for its criminal purpose. A humanitarian aid ship was the perfect way to transport stolen goods without attracting attention. Port authorities rarely subjected charity vessels to thorough inspections. Doing so would be seen as cruel and suspicious, questioning the motives of people supposedly trying to help children. International law provided special protections for humanitarian operations, making it difficult to detain or search such vessels without overwhelming evidence of wrongdoing. And if anyone did discover the gold, the thieves could claim they were simply moving it to a safer location due to security concerns in Burkina Faso, could present forged documents showing authorization from the government. Fatima, excellent work, Ibrahim said, his mind already racing ahead to next steps. I need you to find out everything you can about the organization that operates this ship. Funding sources, board members, operational history, connections to other organizations, everything. If they're involved in this theft, there will be connections to Marcel Dialama or his associates. Money leaves trails and we need to follow them. Colonel Zerbo was studying the ship's route on his screen, his military training showing in how he analyzed the tactical situation. Sir, if this vessel continues on its current heading, it's going to pass through Senegalese territorial waters within 6 hours. After that, it will be in international waters where our ability to intercept it becomes much more complicated, where we'll need cooperation from multiple countries and international organizations that might not be willing to help us. The implication was clear. If Ibrahim was going to act, he had to do it quickly, had to move before the ship reached international waters where it would be protected by a complex web of maritime law. But ordering military action against a humanitarian aid ship would create an international incident that could have serious diplomatic consequences, could make Burkina Faso look like an aggressor attacking a charity organization. He needed proof that the ship was actually carrying stolen gold before he could justify such a dramatic response, needed evidence that would stand up to international scrutiny. That's when Dr. Sankara provided the piece of information that changed everything, the connection that tied all the threads together. Mr. President, she said quietly, her face showing the shock of realization. I just remembered something about Marcel Dialama from before his supposed death. He was working on a project to establish secure transportation methods for gold shipments. The project was called something like Secure African Resource Transportation Initiative. He had been consulting with several international shipping companies about how to move large quantities of gold without attracting attention from criminals or corrupt officials. Ibrahim looked at her sharply. Are you saying he was planning this 10 years ago? That he was setting up the infrastructure for his own theft while he was still working for the government? I'm saying he had the knowledge and the contacts to pull off something like this, Dr. Sankara replied, pulling up old government records on her tablet. And I just realized something else. The charity that operates the Sahelian Hope, the International Children's Development Foundation, received a major donation from the Burkina Faso government 3 years ago. 5 million euros. The donation was approved by... She paused, checking her records to make sure she was correct. Finance Minister Adro Dow. Everything clicked into place with sickening clarity. Finance Minister Traore hadn't just been compromised by the thieves, hadn't been blackmailed or coerced into helping them. He had been working with them for years, had been a willing participant in a long-term conspiracy. He had used government funds to support the very organization that would eventually be used to steal the country's gold reserves, had helped build the infrastructure for his own country's betrayal. Ibrahim felt a cold rage building inside him, a fury that was all the more intense for being controlled and directed. He had trusted Traore, had brought him into the government, despite warnings from some advisors who thought the minister was too close to foreign interests. Now that trust had been betrayed in the most devastating way possible. "Colonel Zerbo," Ibrahim said, his voice hard as steel, "coordinate with the Senegalese Navy. We're going to intercept that ship while it's still in territorial waters where we have legal jurisdiction, and get me President Sall of Senegal on the phone immediately. I need his authorization for a joint maritime operation." The helicopter. Flight to intercept the Sahelian Hope took 2 hours, with Ibrahim accompanied by a small team of Special Forces soldiers from the Presidential Guard and Colonel Zerbo. They had coordinated with the Senegalese Navy, which had dispatched a patrol vessel to ensure that the ship could be stopped and boarded while still in territorial waters where Burkina Faso had legal jurisdiction through its maritime cooperation agreements. President Sall of Senegal had been skeptical at first, understandably concerned about the diplomatic implications of boarding a humanitarian vessel. But Ibrahim had been persuasive, sharing some of the evidence they had gathered about Marcel de Alama and the suspicious shipping manifests. Sall had agreed to provide support, but with the caveat that if Ibrahim was wrong, if this turned out to be a legitimate humanitarian operation, Burkina Faso would bear full responsibility for the international incident. As their military helicopter approached the vessel, everything appeared normal from the air. The ship was exactly where the satellite tracking had indicated, moving steadily through calm seas under clear skies. Its humanitarian markings were clearly visible, the blue and white paint scheme, the large symbols showing books and medical. Crosses, the name Sahelian Hope, painted in multiple languages along the hull. There were no obvious signs of anything unusual happening on board, no indication that this was anything other than a routine humanitarian mission. The crew on deck looked up as the helicopter approached, shading their eyes against the sun. Ibrahim could see their confusion, their concern as they realized this wasn't a routine flyover, but an interception operation. The Senegalese patrol vessel was already alongside the ship, officers using loudspeakers to order it to stop its engines and prepare for boarding. But when the boarding team rappelled down from the helicopter onto the ship's deck, when they secured the area and began their inspection, they were met by a scene that none of them had expected, a discovery that would transform this from a theft investigation into something far more significant. The ship's captain, a Belgian man named Henrik Vermeulen, was cooperative but clearly frightened. He insisted that he knew nothing about stolen gold, that his manifest showed only humanitarian supplies bound for refugee camps in Mali. He provided the paperwork, all of which appeared legitimate and properly filed with international maritime authorities. But when Ibrahim's team forced open the cargo hold, using the authority granted by the joint Burkina Faso-Senegal Maritime Security Agreement, they found a scene that made everything suddenly terribly clear. The cargo hold was indeed filled, with gold bars, thousands of them, stacked in secure containers and exactly matching the specifications of the stolen Burkina Faso reserves. Each bar bore the distinctive stamp of the Burkina Faso Central Bank, the serial numbers matching those in Dr. Sankara's records. The gold was there, $50 billion worth of it, hidden beneath a thin layer of actual humanitarian supplies that would have satisfied any casual inspection. But mixed in with the gold, stored in dozens of reinforced crates secured with sophisticated locks, were documents. Thousands and thousands of documents detailing financial transactions, government communications, economic agreements, and intelligence reports spanning decades. The sheer volume of paper was staggering, filling an entire section of the cargo hold that should have contained medical supplies. Ibrahim stood in the cargo hold, surrounded by the evidence of what appeared to be the largest financial intelligence operation in African history. The gold theft hadn't been the primary objective, he realized with growing horror. It had been a way to gain access to a massive archive of information about African economic affairs, a treasure trove of intelligence that could be used to manipulate and control African governments for generations. "Sir," Colonel Zerbo called from across the hold, his voice tight with shock. "You need to see this immediately." He was standing next to a crate that had been pried open, its contents spilling across the deck. Inside were communications intercepts from multiple African governments, confidential memos, private emails, recorded phone conversations, strategy documents that should have been seen only by the highest levels of government. These documents contain confidential information from Mali, Niger, Senegal, Ghana, Nigeria, Zerbo said, his hands shaking slightly as he held up folders. Financial records, mining agreements, development aid negotiations, everything. Someone has been systematically gathering intelligence on African governments for years. Ibrahim picked up a folder at random, his hands steady despite the fury building inside him. Inside, he found himself reading transcripts of private conversations between African leaders and their economic advisors, discussions about negotiating, positions for trade agreements, internal debates about resource management policies. Another folder contained detailed analyses of every major infrastructure project undertaken in West Africa over the past 5 years, including brutally honest assessments of which projects were profitable and which were designed primarily to create debt dependency. There were reports on the personal lives of government ministers, dossiers that could be used for blackmail. There were economic forecasts that African governments had paid consultants millions to produce, now stolen and available to anyone willing to pay for them. There were classified intelligence assessments, military procurement plans, and strategic documents that represented the most sensitive information of dozens of African nations. But the most shocking discovery was a set of documents that revealed the true scope of Marcel de Alama's activities over the past 10 years. He hadn't just been hiding and planning to steal gold. He had been operating as a master intelligence asset, gathering economic information on behalf of foreign interests while maintaining contacts throughout African government and business circles. The documents showed that de Alama had been present at major economic negotiations across the continent, always in disguise and under false identities, but consistently gathering intelligence about African development plans, resource extraction agreements, and financial vulnerabilities. He had been in Lagos during the Nigerian currency reform negotiations, in Nairobi during the East African Community trade discussions, in Accra during the Ghana IMF debt restructuring talks. Each time he had operated under a different identity with perfect documentation and credentials. Each time, he had positioned himself as an expert consultant or observer, gaining access to confidential discussions and then reporting everything back to his handlers. The man had been a ghost moving through African economic circles for a decade, invisible but omnipresent. "This changes everything," Ibrahim said, his voice barely above a whisper as he studied a particularly damaging document that revealed how foreign aid agreements were deliberately structured to create long-term dependency rather than genuine development. They weren't just stealing our gold. They were using the theft as a way to access and remove evidence of decades of economic manipulation. The document in his hands was a smoking gun, an internal memo from a major international development bank discussing how to structure loan agreements to ensure that African countries would never be able to fully repay them, would remain perpetually dependent on foreign financial assistance. The memo explicitly discussed using debt as a tool for political influence, for ensuring African compliance with Western economic policies. Colonel Zerbo had found another disturbing piece of evidence in a different section of the hold. "Sir, look at this shipping log," he said, showing Ibrahim a leather-bound journal filled with handwritten notes. "This vessel has been making regular trips along the West African coast for 3 years, always carrying humanitarian supplies according to official manifests. but also always making unscheduled stops in small ports, where it wasn't subject to official inspection. The pattern was clear and damning. The Sahelian Hope had been systematically collecting intelligence and documents from multiple African countries, using its humanitarian cover to avoid scrutiny. At each small port, fishing villages and commercial docks that lacked sophisticated customs infrastructure, the ship would take on new cargo, new documents, new intelligence gathered by networks of informants and corrupted officials. The theft of Burkina Faso's gold had been just one operation in a much larger campaign of economic espionage, perhaps the most ambitious, but far from the only one. The ship was essentially a mobile intelligence gathering platform disguised as a charity vessel, protected by international law and public sympathy for humanitarian work. But as Ibrahim was processing the implications of what they had discovered, as he was beginning to understand the true scope of the conspiracy against African sovereignty, his satellite phone rang. The call was from Dr. Sankara back in Ouagadougou, and her voice was urgent with barely controlled panic. "Mr. President, you need to return immediately," she said, her words tumbling over each other. "Finance Minister Dow has called an emergency cabinet meeting. He's claiming that you've gone rogue and stolen the gold reserves yourself. He's presenting evidence to the National Assembly right now, demanding that they remove you from office immediately under constitutional crisis provisions." The trap was closing, Ibrahim realized. While he had been focused on recovering the stolen gold, his enemies had been implementing the second phase of their plan. They were using his absence from the capital and his dramatic military action against the humanitarian ship as evidence that he had become unstable and was acting outside his constitutional authority. "How much support does he have?" Ibrahim asked, his mind already racing through countermeasures and political calculations. "More than we expected," Dr. Sankara replied grimly. "Several cabinet ministers are supporting his position. Transportation Minister Kabore, Agriculture Minister Ouattara, and Development Minister Compaoré. And Dow has presented documents that appear to show you authorizing not just the gold transfer, but several other questionable financial transactions over the past year. Payments to foreign accounts, unexplained transfers, contracts with shell companies." Ibrahim realized that the documents on the ship weren't just intelligence gathered from across Africa. Some of them were sophisticated forgeries designed to implicate him in various forms of corruption and financial mismanagement. The thieves had been preparing for this moment for months, creating a paper trail that would justify removing him from power if their initial extortion attempt failed. But they had made one crucial mistake, one oversight that would prove fatal to their plans. By keeping all of their evidence in one location, by consolidating their intelligence operation on this single ship, they had given Ibrahim the opportunity to prove that the documents were part of a coordinated deception. "Dr. Sankara, I need you to do something immediately," Ibrahim said, his voice steady despite the urgency of the situation. "Contact the international media, Reuters, BBC, Al Jazeera, CNN, France 24, all of them. Tell them that in 1 hour I will be holding a press conference that will expose the largest financial conspiracy in modern African history. Make sure that every major news organization knows about it. I want cameras, I want live broadcasts, I want the entire world watching." "Sir, what are you planning?" Dr. Sankara asked, her voice uncertain. "I'm going to show the world exactly what we found on this ship," Ibrahim replied, looking around at the mountains of evidence surrounding him. All of it. The stolen gold, the intelligence documents, the evidence of economic manipulation, the proof of systematic espionage against African governments, everything. Let's see how Minister Dow explains his connection to all of this when it's broadcast live to the entire planet. The press conference took place on the deck of the Sahelian Hope, with the recovered gold clearly visible in the background, stacks of gold bars gleaming in the afternoon sun, and the incriminating documents spread out on tables for the cameras to see. Ibrahim's decision to broadcast everything live made it impossible for his enemies to control the narrative or suppress the evidence. Within 30 minutes of Dr. Sankara's calls to international media, satellite trucks were being dispatched, helicopters were being chartered, and news organizations around the world were interrupting regular programming to cover this breaking story. The scene was carefully staged for maximum impact. Behind Ibrahim stood members of his Special Forces team, professional and intimidating in their tactical gear. The Senegalese naval officers who had supported the operation stood nearby, their presence lending international legitimacy to the action. And everywhere, filling the deck and spilling out of the cargo hold, was evidence, gold bars, documents, computers, files that represented years of systematic intelligence gathering. People of Burkina Faso, people of Africa, people of the world, Ibrahim began, looking directly into the cameras with the intensity that had made him a compelling political figure. Today we have uncovered evidence of a conspiracy so vast and so sophisticated that it touches every aspect of African economic life. What began as the theft of our gold reserves has revealed a decades-long campaign of economic espionage and manipulation, designed to keep our continent under foreign control. He gestured to the documents behind him, to the mountains of evidence that represented the theft of not just gold, but of African agency and independence. These papers contain evidence of how aid agreements are structured to create dependency rather than development, how mining contracts are designed to benefit foreign companies at the expense of African peoples, and how our own economic data has been systematically stolen and used against us in international negotiations. Ibrahim held up one of the documents, an internal memo from a major international financial institution discussing strategies for maintaining Western economic influence in Africa. This document, he said, his voice hard with anger, explicitly discusses using debt as a tool for political control. It recommends structuring loans in ways that ensure African countries can never fully repay them, ensuring perpetual dependency on foreign financial assistance and foreign policy guidance. He moved to another table, picking up a thick folder. These are transcripts of confidential communications between African leaders and their advisors, stolen through systematic surveillance of our government networks. Someone has been listening to our most private discussions, reading our most confidential documents, and using that intelligence to stay one step ahead of any attempt at genuine African economic independence. But perhaps most importantly, Ibrahim revealed the connection between the theft and the attempted political coup in Ouagadougou, the link that tied everything together. Finance Minister Idro Dow was not just complicit in this theft, Ibrahim announced, his voice carrying clearly across the water and through the cameras to audiences around the world. The documents we have recovered show that he has been working with foreign intelligence services for over 3 years, providing them with confidential information about our government's economic policies and helping them develop strategies to undermine our independence. He held up another document, an email exchange between Dow and someone identified only as coordinator, discussing Ibrahim's policy initiatives and how to counter them. "This is treason," Ibrahim said simply. "This is betrayal of the highest order. And the evidence is irrefutable." The international reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Within hours of the press conference, similar investigations were being launched in multiple African countries as leaders realized that they too might have been victims of the same type of economic espionage. The evidence that Ibrahim had made public provided a roadmap for understanding how foreign influence had been operating across the continent, a blueprint that could be used to identify and counter similar operations elsewhere. Social media exploded with commentary, analysis, and debate. African gold theft and economic espionage trended worldwide. Television networks devoted hours to dissecting the documents, bringing in experts to explain the implications of what had been revealed. Young Africans celebrated Ibrahim as a hero who had exposed the hidden mechanisms of neo-colonial control. International relations experts debated what this meant for the future of North-South economic relationships, but perhaps the most significant outcome was the effect on public opinion within Burkina Faso itself. The attempted political coup collapsed when it became clear that Minister Dow had been working with foreign agents to steal the country's gold reserves. The cabinet ministers who had supported Dow's motion suddenly found themselves under investigation, their political careers in ruins. The National Assembly, which had been preparing to debate removing Ibrahim from office, instead passed a unanimous resolution, praising his leadership and calling for a full investigation into foreign interference in Burkina Faso's economic affairs. Instead, of being seen as a rogue president who had lost control. Ibrahim was celebrated as a leader who had exposed and defeated a major conspiracy against African sovereignty. His approval ratings, which had been declining under the pressure of economic challenges, soared to their highest levels since he took office. The gold was returned to the Central Bank of Burkina Faso within a week, transported under heavy guard and with full media coverage. But the documents from the ship continued to provide intelligence about foreign economic operations across Africa for months afterward. Teams of researchers and intelligence analysts worked through the thousands of pages, piecing together networks of influence and identifying individuals and organizations that had been working against African interests. The information led to the exposure of similar intelligence networks in 6 other countries and resulted in a fundamental restructuring of how African nations approached economic security. Governments upgraded their cybersecurity infrastructure, implemented new protocols for protecting sensitive communications, and established continental mechanisms for sharing intelligence about foreign interference. Marcel Dealama was eventually located and arrested in a villa outside Paris, where he had been living under an assumed identity while coordinating intelligence operations across Africa. His arrest came 3 months after the press conference, the result of patient detective work by Burkinabe intelligence services working with French authorities who were embarrassed by the scandal and eager to demonstrate that they weren't complicit in the conspiracy. Dealama's interrogation revealed details of a network that extended far beyond what even the documents had shown. He named names, identified handlers, and explained operational methods. His testimony led to the exposure of dozens of African officials who had been recruited to work for foreign intelligence services, some motivated by money, others by blackmail, and a few by genuine ideological conviction that African countries needed foreign guidance. But Dealama also revealed something that troubled Ibrahim deeply. The conspiracy had been even more extensive than they had realized. The gold theft and the intelligence operation on the ship had been just one branch of a much larger effort to maintain foreign control over African economic policy. There were other operations still running, other networks still active, other Marcel Dealamas out there operating under deep cover. "You think you've won?" Dealama said during one interrogation session, his voice bitter with the knowledge of his own failure and capture. "You think you've exposed us and defeated us? But you've only seen one operation, one network. There are others you haven't found. This has been going on for decades, and it will continue for decades more. You can't stop it by catching me." Ibrahim had listened to the recording of that interrogation with a cold determination. Dealama was probably right that there were other operations, other conspiracies still hidden. But the difference now was that African governments knew what to look for, understood the tactics and methods used against them, and were coordinating their responses in ways that had never happened before. Perhaps the most important long-term consequence was the change in how African leaders understood the threats they faced. The Burkina Faso gold theft had demonstrated that economic warfare could be just as dangerous as military conflicts, that defending African sovereignty required much more sophisticated intelligence and security capabilities than most countries possessed. 6 months after the theft, Ibrahim addressed the African Union about the lessons learned from the conspiracy. The speech was held in Addis Ababa, with leaders from across the continent in attendance. The atmosphere was electric with possibility, with a sense that something fundamental was changing in how Africa engaged with the world. "Brothers and sisters," Ibrahim began, speaking without notes, his passion evident in every word. "We learned that our enemies are not just trying to steal our resources. They are trying to steal our knowledge, our plans, our hopes for the future. They want to know everything we are thinking before we think it, everything we are planning before we plan it. They want to be inside our decision-making processes, shaping our choices before we even realize we're making them." He paused, letting his words sink in. "But we also learned something else, something more important. We learned that when we work together, when we share information and coordinate our responses, when we stand united instead of allowing ourselves to be isolated and picked off one by one, then we are strong enough to defend ourselves. Then we can win." The speech received a standing ovation and led to the creation of the African Economic Security Initiative, a continental organization designed to protect African economic interests through intelligence sharing and coordinated security measures. The initiative was funded by contributions from member states and operated out of a new facility in Kigali, Rwanda, chosen for its strong governance and sophisticated security infrastructure. The initiative's first major success came within 6 months of its establishment. Intelligence analysts working for the new organization detected a similar operation being planned against Nigeria's foreign currency reserves. The operation followed many of the same patterns as the Burkina Faso theft: trusted insiders being recruited, fake authorizations being prepared, a seemingly legitimate cover story for moving the reserves. But this time, African governments were prepared. The operation was disrupted before it could be implemented, the conspirators were arrested, and the evidence was shared across the continent to help other countries identify similar vulnerabilities in their own systems. It was a powerful demonstration that the lessons from Burkina Faso were being applied effectively, that African economic security was genuinely improving. But for Ibrahim personally, the most important outcome was the realization that the threats facing African independence were far more sophisticated and long-term than he had previously understood. The gold theft had been just one operation in a campaign that had been going on for decades and would likely continue for decades more. The fight for genuine African economic sovereignty wasn't something that could be won in a single dramatic confrontation. It required sustained effort, constant vigilance, and ongoing cooperation among African nations. The vault that had been emptied in Ouagadougou was eventually refilled, but with new security measures that took into account the lessons learned from the theft. The gold was no longer just protected by locks and alarms, but by intelligence networks that could detect threats before they developed into active operations, by continental cooperation that made it impossible to isolate and target individual countries, and by a new generation of African security professionals trained to recognize and counter sophisticated economic warfare tactics. Every time Ibrahim visited the vault after its refilling, he remembered the moment when he had stood in front of those empty shelves and realized that someone had stolen his country's future. That moment had changed everything, not just for Burkina Faso, but for Africa as a whole. It had been a crisis that had forced African leaders to confront uncomfortable truths about their vulnerability to foreign manipulation and their lack of coordination in defending their interests. The thieves who had planned to use the gold theft to control Burkina Faso's economic policies had achieved something they never intended. They had exposed the entire system of economic manipulation that had kept Africa dependent on foreign powers for decades. In trying to steal one country's future, they had inadvertently helped secure the future of an entire continent. Today, when African economists talk about economic security, they often reference the Burkina Faso gold theft as the moment when the continent began to understand the true nature of the threats it faced. University courses analyze the incident as a case study in both economic warfare and effective crisis response. Intelligence services study the operation as an example of sophisticated espionage tactics and the importance of international coordination. In countering them, the empty vault that had seemed like a catastrophe had actually been the beginning of Africa's real economic independence, the catalyst for changes that might not have happened for decades otherwise. Sometimes, as Ibrahim often reflected, the greatest victories come not from preventing disasters, but from how you respond to them, from what you learn and what you build in their aftermath. Ibrahim Traoré, the young president who had stood in that empty vault and refused to be broken by what he saw, had proven that sometimes the greatest victories come not from preventing theft, but from using the theft to expose the thieves and everything they represent. The gold had been returned, but the knowledge gained from its theft, the understanding of how foreign economic control actually operated, the networks and tactics and strategies used to maintain African dependency would protect African wealth for generations to come. Sometimes the most valuable thing you can steal from a thief is the understanding of how they operate. That understanding, once gained and once shared among those who have been victimized, becomes a weapon that can never be stolen back, a form of power that grows rather than diminishes with use. But what Ibrahim didn't know What he couldn't have known in those early days of triumph and celebration was that the recovery of the gold had triggered something far more dangerous than the original theft. In the shadows of international finance, in boardrooms and private clubs where the real decisions about global economic policy were made, powerful forces were realizing that their centuries-old system of African economic control was being exposed and dismantled by a young president who refused to play by their rules. 3 days after the live broadcast from the ship's deck, after the international media had moved on to other stories, but before the full implications of Ibrahim's revelations had fully manifested, he received a call that would make him understand the true scope of what he was fighting against. The caller wasn't using the same French-accented voice from before. This time, the voice was American, crisp and professional, with the kind of confident authority that suggested military or intelligence background. It was the voice of someone used to giving orders and having them obeyed, someone who dealt in power as a daily currency. "President Traore," the voice began without preamble, without any pretense of diplomatic niceties. "My name is Director Harrison from the International Financial Stability Consortium. What you did on that ship 3 days ago has created some serious problems that we need to discuss." Ibrahim was in his private office in the presidential palace, working late as had become his habit since the gold theft. The palace was quiet except for the distant sounds of security patrols, the building settling around him. Colonel Zerbo was present, monitoring the call as they had done with all communications since the conspiracy was discovered, recording every word for analysis. "I've never heard of your organization," Ibrahim replied carefully, his instincts telling him this was a different kind of threat than they had faced before. "Most people haven't," Harrison continued, his tone matter of fact. "We prefer to work behind the scenes to maintain global economic stability. We're not an official organization, not something you'll find on any government registry. We're more of an informal coordination mechanism among people who understand how the global economy actually works. But your recent actions have forced us to consider a more direct approach." Ibrahim felt a chill run down his spine despite the warm night. The casual way the man spoke about direct approaches suggested capabilities that went far beyond normal diplomatic or economic pressure, resources and methods that existed in the gray areas of international relations. "What exactly are you saying?" Ibrahim asked, keeping his voice neutral. "I'm saying that your little publicity stunt with those documents has destabilized carefully maintained economic relationships across 3 continents," Harrison replied, his voice taking on a harder edge. "Markets don't like uncertainty, President Traore. Investors get nervous when they think the rules might be changing. And right now, you've made yourself the single greatest source of uncertainty in global financial systems. Do you have any idea how much money was wiped off stock exchanges in the 2 hours after your press conference? How many carefully negotiated agreements are now being questioned?" The conversation continued for 20 minutes, with Harrison outlining a series of recommendations for how Ibrahim could help restore stability to international markets. The recommendations, presented in the clinical language of economic policy, amounted to reversing every economic independence policy that Burkina Faso had implemented over the past 3 years. Harrison wanted Ibrahim to accept international oversight of all major financial decisions, to agree to long-term resource extraction agreements that would essentially return the country to colonial-era economic relationships, and to publicly distance himself from the more inflammatory accusations he had made during the press conference. "We understand that you needed to make a strong statement," Harrison said, his tone becoming almost conciliatory. "Politics requires theater sometimes. But now it's time to be practical, to work within the system rather than trying to tear it down. The system has existed for centuries because it works, because it creates stability and prosperity." But the most chilling part came at the end of the call, when Harrison dropped the diplomatic language and spoke with naked honesty about power and consequences. "President Traore, I want you to understand something very clearly," Harrison said, his voice hardening into something cold and final. "The people I represent have been managing global economic relationships for over 2 centuries. We've guided the development of capitalism, shaped the architecture of international finance, determined which countries prosper and which countries struggle. We've seen leaders like you before, young, idealistic, convinced that they can change systems that are bigger and older than any single country or any single generation. He paused, and Ibrahim could hear the implicit threat in that silence. Some of them learned to work within existing frameworks. They realized that cooperation brings rewards, that there are ways to improve conditions for their people without disrupting the fundamental order that keeps the global economy functioning. Others, another pause, longer and more meaningful, others discovered that the world can be a very dangerous place for those who refuse to cooperate. Accidents happen. Health crises emerge. Political opposition finds unexpected resources and support. The line went dead, leaving Ibrahim staring at the phone with the sick realization that he had just received a death threat from an organization he had never heard of, but which apparently had the power to eliminate heads of state who became inconvenient. The threat was all the more effective for being indirect, for relying on implication rather than explicit statement. "Did you get all of that?" Ibrahim asked Colonel Zerbo. "Every word," Zerbo replied, his face grim. "Sir, we need to upgrade your security immediately. If this organization is as powerful as Harrison suggests, if they have the capability to orchestrate regime change operations, then you're in serious danger." But what happened next would prove that Ibrahim's enemies had severely underestimated both his courage and his strategic intelligence. Instead of being intimidated by the threat, instead of backing down or looking for compromise, Ibrahim decided to do something that no African leader had ever attempted before on this scale. He was going to expose the entire global system of economic control by using the very networks that his enemies thought gave them power. "Colonel Zerbo," Ibrahim said after a moment of thought, his voice calm and determined, "I want you to set up secure communication links with every African head of state tonight. Use the continental security network we established after the ship incident. And I want similar links established with leaders in Asia, Latin America, and any other region where countries have struggled with economic independence and foreign interference." "Sir," "That's going to require coordinating with dozens of governments simultaneously," Zerbo said, already pulling out his phone to begin the complex task. "Are you planning some kind of international conference?" "I'm planning something much more ambitious," Ibrahim replied, a slight smile playing at his lips despite the gravity of the situation. "I'm going to share everything we learned from the ship's documents with every leader who has ever been told that they need to accept international economic oversight for their own good, every country that's been forced to choose between sovereignty and survival. And then we're going to coordinate a response that will make the Burkina Faso gold theft look like a small opening move in a much larger game." The logistics of what Ibrahim was proposing were staggering. He was talking about creating a real-time intelligence-sharing network that would include dozens of countries across multiple continents, all coordinating to expose economic manipulation tactics that had been used against them for decades. It was unprecedented in scope and ambition, but the more Ibrahim thought about it, the more convinced he became that this was the only way to defeat enemies who operated on a global scale. Individual countries could be isolated, pressured, and ultimately forced to submit. He had just received a direct threat that proved that reality. But if dozens of countries acted together, sharing information and coordinating their responses, presenting a united front against economic coercion, then the traditional tools of economic warfare would become much less effective. The story of the Burkina Faso gold theft became a legend, told and retold in universities and government ministries across Africa and beyond. But it was what came after, the continental awakening that Ibrahim's discovery triggered, that truly changed the course of history. The coordination network Ibrahim, established that night, expanded to include 47 countries within a month. Leaders from Africa, Asia, Latin America, and even some smaller European nations joined what came to be called the Global Economic Sovereignty Alliance. They shared intelligence, coordinated responses to economic pressure, and developed new models for international financial relationships based on genuine partnership rather than exploitation. The International Financial Stability Consortium tried to counter this movement. Using all the tools at their disposal, economic pressure, political manipulation, media campaigns designed to portray the alliance as dangerous radicalism. But they had underestimated how deeply resentment of economic colonialism ran, how ready people around the world were for alternatives to the existing system. Within 3 years, the global economic architecture had fundamentally changed. New development banks emerged, controlled by developing nations rather than Western powers. Alternative currency systems reduced dependence on the dollar and euro. Resource-rich countries began demanding genuine partnerships rather than extractive contracts. It wasn't a revolution, it was too gradual and negotiated for that, but it was transformation nonetheless. The world that emerged was more multipolar, more equitable, and ultimately more stable than what had come before. Ibrahim Traoré served 2 terms as president of Burkina Faso, leaving office at the age of 50 to work with the African Union on continental economic integration. The vault where he had discovered the theft became a museum, a place where young Africans came to learn about the moment when their continent stopped accepting economic subjugation and started demanding genuine independence. The gold itself remained in Burkina Faso, backing a currency that became a model for African monetary cooperation. But more valuable than the gold was the knowledge it had helped uncover, the networks it had exposed, and the determination it had awakened. Sometimes the greatest victories come not from what is taken from you, but from what you discover in the act of taking it back. The theft of Burkina Faso's gold had revealed a system of control that had operated in shadows for generations. The recovery of that gold had shown that even the most powerful systems could be challenged and changed by people determined to build something better. And every time someone asked Ibrahim how he had found the courage to stand against such powerful forces, he gave the same answer. I stood in an empty vault and realized that my country's future had been stolen. At that moment, I had a choice: accept the theft or fight to recover what was taken. And once you decide to fight, once you refuse to be broken by what you've lost, you discover strength you didn't know you possessed. The empty vault had been filled again. But more importantly, the empty promises of economic development without sovereignty, of prosperity through dependence, of progress through submission. Those had been exposed for the hollow deceptions they were. The thieves had stolen gold. But in doing so, they had inadvertently given Africa something far more valuable: the proof that change was possible and the inspiration to make it happen. That was the true story of the vault, and it was still being written.